A wedding is meant to be the culmination of trust, not its destruction. At 45, Vernon Miller had built his life on verification, his career in digital forensics making him the man people called when they needed irrefutable truth. So when his best man Marcus stood during the toast and announced that Vernon's bride was carrying his child, the church fell into stunned silence, waiting for Vernon to crumble. 6 months after burying his mother on what should have been the happiest day of his life, Vernon stood alone before family and friends as his world publicly shattered. But what no one expected, least of all Marcus, was the slight smile that formed on Vernon's lips as he reached into his jacket pocket. Some betrayals demand more than tears. Some require justice. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone turned devastating betrayal into their finest hour? The string quartet finished their piece as servers circulated with champagne flutes through Vernon Miller's meticulously renovated craftsman home. The engagement party had been his idea. Grace had wanted something smaller, but Vernon believed milestones deserved proper celebration. His mother would have insisted on it. Golden evening light filtered through leaded glass windows, illuminating the hardwood floors Vernon had restored himself, plank by painstaking plank. Each element of the home reflected his methodical nature. The antique furniture carefully selected over years, the art precisely positioned, the garden, visible through French doors, mathematically plotted for continuous seasonal blooming. To Vernon and Grace, Marcus Daniels raised his glass, the crystal catching light from the antique chandelier Vernon had found at an estate sale and rewired himself. My oldest friend, who deserves every happiness after supporting all of us through our worst moments. Vernon nodded appreciatively, his arm around Grace's waist. At 35, she practically glowed beside him, her auburn hair cascading over bare shoulders. The emerald pendant he'd given her last Christmas nestled at her throat. Vernon caught his sister Rebecca's analytical gaze from across the room and offered a small smile. Rebecca had always been the cautious one, assessing situations before committing, a trait that made her an excellent attorney and occasionally exhausting sister. Vernon planned everything himself, Grace told an admiring guest, her hand resting lightly on his chest. He even remembered my favorite flowers from our third date. Details matter, Vernon said, excusing himself to greet new arrivals. As he moved through the crowd of 40 carefully selected guests, he glimpsed Marcus placing his hand on Grace's lower back, leaning close to whisper something. She laughed, her head tilting back slightly, his hand lingering a moment too long. The gesture was so quick, so seemingly innocent, that Vernon dismissed the momentary discomfort. After 25 years of friendship, Marcus was practically family. Vernon straightened a slightly askew photograph on the side table, a habit formed from childhood when his mother insisted that precision reflected character. The framed photograph of his mother watched over the proceedings from the mantel, her absence still a raw wound 6 months after her funeral. He adjusted the frame slightly, another habitual gesture, everything in its proper place. 3 weeks later, Vernon sat in his home office reviewing quarterly financial reports when Marcus arrived unannounced, his normally confident demeanor replaced with uncharacteristic distress. Vernon's office reflected his professional precision. Dual monitors displaying complex data analysis, bookshelves organized by subject and author, certificates of digital forensic certification displayed on one wall. "I hate asking," Marcus said, pacing before Vernon's methodically organized desk. "But the landlord's giving me 3 days. With this economy and my contract ending—" He trailed off, running a hand through his artfully tousled hair. Marcus had always been this way, brilliant but erratic, charming but perpetually in some self-created crisis. In college, Vernon had edited his papers. In their 20s, Vernon had provided temporary housing after Marcus's first divorce, In their 30s, Vernon had connected him with the position at Meridian Digital Securities, where they both now worked, albeit in different departments. Vernon closed his laptop. "We've known each other 25 years, Marcus. You don't need to explain. I'll pay you back every cent. I promise I won't let you down." "Family doesn't keep score," Vernon replied, opening his checkbook. "My mother taught me that." As Vernon wrote the check, he didn't immediately notice Grace hovering near the doorway, nor the way Marcus squeezed her shoulder when Vernon turned to retrieve his pen. But later, as he reflected on the interaction, these details resurfaced with unexpected clarity. The dining room table disappeared beneath sample invitations and venue brochures 2 months before the wedding. Vernon's systematic organization, color-coded folders, and neatly labeled cost comparisons contrasted with Grace's scattered approach. She'd drop a brochure, become distracted by flower arrangements, then move to discussing the guest list without resolution. "What about the lakeside gardens?" Marcus suggested, pointing to a brochure. "They have that gazebo overlooking the water." Grace tensed visibly. "I don't think that location would work for us. I just thought since you mentioned loving it when we—" Marcus stopped abruptly. Vernon looked up from his spreadsheet. "When you what?" "When we drove past it last month," Grace recovered smoothly. "You were working that weekend, remember? The corporate espionage case." Vernon nodded, though he didn't recall Grace mentioning the drive. Before he could inquire further, the doorbell chimed. Mrs. Abernathy, Vernon's elderly neighbor, stood on the porch holding a wrapped package. At 78, she remained fiercely independent, her posture still straight despite arthritis that sometimes left her hands gnarled and painful. "Wedding gift," she announced, placing it on the entry table. "Thought I'd deliver it personally rather than send it with my nephew to the ceremony." Vernon invited her in for tea, noting her keen observation of the wedding planning session. She had been his mother's closest friend, the two women sharing gardening tips and life philosophies across 3 decades. As she prepared to leave, she squeezed Vernon's arm. "Remember what I always told your mother, Vernon. Trust is good, but clarity is better." That evening, Vernon reached for the shared tablet to check wedding expenses. The password had been changed from their anniversary date. When he asked Grace about it, she blamed auto-update security features and quickly reset it. But something in her hurried explanation struck Vernon as discordant, a single wrong note in an otherwise perfect composition. If you've ever had that first moment of doubt about someone you trusted completely, you'll understand what happened next. Rain streaked Vernon's office windows as he sat alone at his desk, the glow of multiple monitors illuminating his concentrated expression. The digital forensics lab, where he worked 50 hours a week, was sterile and impersonal compared to his home office. But tonight he appreciated the professional distance the environment provided. Grace's bachelorette weekend in wine country had begun that morning, 3 days of celebration with her bridesmaids before the wedding next weekend. Vernon had insisted she enjoy herself without concerns about last-minute details. He would handle everything. "Just a quick backup," Vernon murmured to himself, connecting Grace's phone to his computer. She'd mentioned wanting a new device after the honeymoon, and Vernon had offered to preserve her data. A simple courtesy, or so he'd thought. The backup process began automatically, familiar territory for someone who extracted digital evidence for a living. Vernon reviewed case notes for an upcoming court testimony while the progress bar advanced steadily across the screen. Then a notification appeared. A text message from Marcus. "Miss you already. 3 days is too long." Vernon's hand froze above the keyboard. Professional instinct overrode personal hesitation as he opened the message history. "He has no idea. Sometimes I feel bad, but he's so boring compared to us. After the wedding, we'll have access to everything. Just be patient. Playing best man is getting harder. The things I do for love." The timestamps tracked backward through months of exchanges, intimate photos, meeting arrangements, declarations. The first messages dated exactly 1 week after his mother's funeral. Vernon remembered the day clearly. He'd been arranging her personal effects while Grace claimed a migraine and canceled their dinner plans. Marcus had texted condolences, explaining he couldn't visit because of work deadlines. Vernon felt a coldness spreading through his chest, the kind he recognized from courtroom testimonies when irrefutable evidence changed everything. The rational part of his brain, the professional examiner of digital facts, took control as the personal part threatened to collapse. He began a systematic search, his training taking over where emotion might have destroyed another man. Bank statements revealed a pattern of transfers from their joint account to an unknown destination. With methodical precision, Vernon traced the money to a separate account co-owned by Grace and Marcus. As hours passed, Vernon built a comprehensive timeline of betrayal. Messages referenced meetings during his business trips. Expenses appeared for hotel rooms and restaurants on dates when Grace claimed girls' nights or work events. Financial documents showed transfers timed to Marcus's supposed emergencies. Most damning was a conversation about the wedding itself, a detailed plan to access Vernon's accounts once the marriage was legal, combined with discussions about how to minimize suspicion during what they called the transition period. Vernon read the conversations with detached professionalism, as if analyzing evidence for a client rather than documenting the systematic destruction of his own life. Morning light cast harsh shadows across the kitchen table, now covered with financial records. Vernon had worked through the night, assembling evidence with the same attention to detail he brought to his professional cases. Grace's graduate school tuition, $43,000 over 3 years. Support for Marcus through multiple emergencies. A joint account being systematically drained for months. Vernon's phone buzzed with his sister's name on the display. "Rebecca," he answered, his voice steadier than he expected. "I need your legal expertise, not your sympathy right now." "Vernon, it's okay to be angry. This is—" "I am angry," he interrupted. "But anger without strategy is just noise. Mother always said that." The quotation from their mother, one of many precise aphorisms that had guided their childhood, steadied him further. Eleanor Miller had raised them with exacting standards after their father's early death, teaching them that emotional control was the foundation of effective action. "What are you planning to do?" "Nothing. Yet, I need more information." After ending the call, Vernon went to find aspirin for his developing headache. In Grace's purse, his fingers brushed against an unfamiliar bottle. Prenatal vitamins. The manufacturing date indicated they'd been purchased 6 weeks earlier. The final piece slid into place with devastating clarity. 2 days later, Vernon sat across from Rebecca in her law office, surrounded by family photos and legal credentials. Grace's name flashed on his phone for the 3rd time in an hour. "You could confront them now, file for the financial damages," Rebecca suggested, pushing a folder of legal documents across her desk. The corner of each page aligned perfectly with the next, a habit she'd developed watching her brother's methodical approach to life. Vernon silenced the call without looking at the screen. "And give them time to create explanations?" "No." "What are you thinking?" "They've planned this humiliation for months. They want to control the narrative. And you want to control it instead." Vernon's expression remained composed, but his eyes held a determination Rebecca recognized from his toughest cases. "I want the truth to control it, in front of the same witnesses they plan to use against me." Rebecca leaned back, studying her brother. At 48, 3 years his senior, she had always been the more cautious sibling. Vernon took calculated risks. Rebecca avoided them entirely. But she recognized the resolute set of his jaw, the same expression their mother had worn when making irrevocable decisions. "The wedding is in 5 days, Vernon." "Let them think everything is normal," he said, placing the phone face down as Grace's name appeared again. "The wedding will proceed exactly as planned." The strategy was forming with precision in Vernon's mind, not from emotional reactivity, but from the same analytical approach that made him exceptional at his profession. Evidence, documentation, strategic revelation, proportional consequences. "I'll need your help with the legal preparations," he told Rebecca. "And I need everything ready by Saturday morning." Have you ever discovered something that changed everything you thought you knew about someone close to you? Morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the church preparation room. Vernon adjusted his cufflinks with precise movements, his tuxedo immaculate, every detail attended to with characteristic thoroughness. A small photograph of his mother, tucked into his inside pocket, pressed against his heart. The past 5 days had passed in a blur of preparation. Grace had returned from her bachelorette weekend with elaborate stories about wine tours and spa treatments. Vernon had listened attentively, noting the discrepancies between her account and the text messages he'd documented. When she'd asked about wedding details, he'd assured her everything was progressing perfectly. In a way it was. "You seem unusually calm for a groom," his father observed, struggling with his bow tie. At 72, Arthur Miller's hands no longer possessed their former dexterity, though his mind remained sharp. Vernon moved to assist him, straightening the fabric with practiced ease. "I've waited 45 years to get this right. Nothing today will happen without my full awareness." Arthur studied his son's face. "There's something different about you today. Not nerves, exactly." "Focus," Vernon supplied. "Complete clarity about what matters." Outside the door, footsteps approached, and Marcus entered, best man's boutonniere already affixed to his lapel. His confident smile faltered slightly at Vernon's composed demeanor. "Having second thoughts?" Marcus asked, attempting nonchalance. "Not at all," Vernon replied, checking his watch. "I believe everyone will get exactly what they deserve today." The ambiguity in Vernon's statement passed unnoticed as Marcus launched into a rehearsed speech about final preparations and ring responsibilities. Vernon observed his friend of 25 years with clinical detachment, noting the slightly elevated pitch of his voice and the excessive hand gestures that always indicated Marcus's nervous energy. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, Vernon standing at the altar as the string quartet played Pachelbel's canon, the guests rising as Grace walked down the aisle on her father's arm. She was beautiful in ivory lace, her smile radiant beneath her veil. Only Vernon recognized the performance for what it was, having seen the text messages where she'd discussed this very moment with Marcus. "Just think, while I'm walking toward him, I'll be carrying your child. It's almost poetic justice for how boring he is." Vernon's responses came automatically, years of courtroom testimony teaching him to speak clearly under pressure. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. They processed to the reception hall within the church, where champagne waited for the toast. 150 guests settled at tables arranged around a small dance floor, elderly relatives and business colleagues mingling with friends and neighbors. Vernon helped his father to a seat at the head table, then took his place beside Grace. Marcus stood, champagne flute raised, commanding the room's attention. "Before we celebrate this union," Marcus began, his voice carrying through the suddenly quiet hall. "There's a truth that needs acknowledging." Vernon felt the moment suspend, like the fraction of a second between a trigger pull and impact. "The bride is carrying my child," Marcus announced, eyes fixed on Vernon. "Vernon, I never meant for this to happen, but Grace and I have fallen in love." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Grace produced tears with practiced ease. "I'm so sorry, Vernon," she said, voice breaking perfectly. "We didn't want to hurt you." Vernon's father half rose from his seat, face flushed with anger. "How dare you?" "It's all right, Dad," Vernon said quietly, placing a restraining hand on his father's arm. "Please, sit down." The room waited for collapse, for rage, for the scene to devolve into the humiliation Marcus and Grace had so carefully choreographed. Instead, Vernon straightened his tie and stood. "Actually, Marcus, I'd like to offer my response," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Vernon's calm demeanor visibly unsettled Marcus, whose triumphant expression began to falter. Grace's tears paused momentarily, confusion replacing practiced remorse. "I've known about the affair for weeks," Vernon announced, voice steady. The room fell completely silent. "What you don't know, Marcus, is that in my profession, evidence is everything." "Whatever you think you know," Marcus started, but Vernon raised a hand. "I know the affair began at my mother's funeral," Vernon continued, removing a folder from his jacket. "I know about the joint account you opened. And I know those pregnancy test results are 6 weeks old, which means you planned this announcement for maximum effect." Grace reached for Vernon's arm. "Vernon, please, not like this." "Interesting," Vernon replied, opening the folder. "That's exactly what you texted Marcus about me 3 days ago." The whispers among wedding guests grew as understanding dawned. Vernon's sister, Rebecca, stood from her table, moving to stand supportively behind her brother. The wedding photographer, sensing historic documentation in progress, continued taking pictures, her camera capturing Marcus's expression, shifting from triumph to confusion to alarm. Vernon turned to address the stunned guests. "I apologize for the unconventional ceremony, but if you'll bear with me a few more minutes, I believe what comes next will be worth your time." Sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal isn't anger, it's calm, irrefutable truth. Vernon motioned to a colleague who wheeled in a projection screen as Grace and Marcus exchanged alarmed glances. When they attempted to leave, 2 groomsmen, longtime friends from Vernon's firm, discreetly blocked their path. "I believe transparency is appropriate given the public nature of this announcement," Vernon said, connecting his laptop to the projector. "First, let's discuss finances." The screen displayed meticulous spreadsheets and bank statements, organized with forensic precision. Vernon had spent hours preparing these slides, ensuring they told the complete story while remaining comprehensible to a non-technical audience. "I've supported Grace through graduate school, $43,000 over 3 years, Vernon explained, his tone professional rather than accusatory. "During that time, she transferred $37,500 to this account, co-owned with Marcus." Grace's face flushed. "That was for wedding expenses." "Interesting explanation for transfers that began 2 years before our engagement," Vernon replied, advancing to the next slide showing the timeline. He highlighted specific transactions, noting dates and amounts with the same methodical precision he would use in court testimony. "The evidence suggests a pattern of systematic financial exploitation," Vernon continued. "Note that each transfer from our joint account coincides with supposedly separate financial emergencies Marcus experienced." Marcus stepped forward. "You're embarrassing yourself, Vernon." "No, Marcus. For the first time in our friendship, I'm seeing clearly, Vernon replied, clicking to a series of text message screenshots. Let's discuss how you planned today's announcement. The messages appeared on screen, enlarged for all to see. Marcus to Grace. Announcing at the wedding gives us everything: his public humiliation, your family's sympathy, and access to assets before he can protect them. Guests murmured as the evidence mounted. Vernon noticed Grace's parents exchanging horrified glances, her father's face reddening with what appeared to be a combination of embarrassment and anger. "Those are private messages," Grace protested. "You had no right." "Interesting ethical boundary from someone planning to commit marriage fraud," Vernon observed, his tone remaining even. "Your concern for privacy seems situational at best." Marcus attempted to regain control. "This is pathetic, Vernon. You violated her privacy because you couldn't keep her happy." "No, I respected her privacy until I had legal cause to protect myself," Vernon countered. "My sister, the attorney, can explain the distinction." Rebecca stood from her table, adding her professional authority to Vernon's statement. Under state law, evidence of fraud and financial exploitation creates legal grounds for protective documentation. Everything my brother has presented was obtained and prepared within appropriate legal boundaries. Before she could continue, an elderly voice called from the back of the room. "I have something to add to the evidence." Mrs. Abernathy rose shakily, supported by her nephew. "I've seen them together at Vernon's house when he was traveling. I dismissed it because I couldn't believe anyone would betray such a good man." Her statement opened the floodgates. A young woman Vernon recognized as Marcus's ex-girlfriend stood next. "Marcus has done this before. He told me our relationship was open while pursuing someone else." One of Grace's bridesmaids, visibly uncomfortable, spoke reluctantly. "Grace told us not to say anything. She said Vernon would never notice." Vernon allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. "I notice everything." It's literally my profession. The room had transformed from a wedding reception to something resembling a courtroom, with Vernon as both prosecutor and wronged party. Marcus and Grace found themselves increasingly isolated as the evidence mounted. Vernon displayed a final document on the screen. "I've already legally separated our finances. The accounts you planned to access after the wedding were closed last week." He turned to face Grace and Marcus directly. "I believe in consequences proportional to actions. Your consequence is this moment, the truth, revealed before the same witnesses you intended for my humiliation." For the first time, Marcus appeared genuinely shaken. Grace's tears were no longer performative, but stemmed from genuine distress as her carefully constructed plan collapsed. "You had this planned all along," Marcus said, realization dawning. "You knew and still went through with the wedding." "I learned from experts," Vernon replied. "You two demonstrated precisely how to present one reality while preparing for another." The wedding photographer moved closer, documenting the confrontation from multiple angles. Vernon noticed her exchanging business cards with his colleague. Evidence would continue to circulate beyond this moment. Vernon addressed the guests with dignified composure. "To everyone who traveled to be here, the reception will continue as planned. Consider it a celebration of truth rather than marriage." A guest called out, "What about them? Are they staying?" "That's entirely their choice," Vernon replied. "I've said what needed saying. How they respond is their own moral decision." Grace's father approached his daughter, his expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Grace, we need to talk, now." Marcus made one final attempt to salvage his reputation. "Vernon has clearly manipulated evidence. He works with digital files." The wedding photographer stepped forward, camera in hand. "I have photos of you together from the rehearsal dinner. The way you were touching wasn't friendly." As murmurs of support for Vernon grew throughout the room, Marcus and Grace retreated separately, rejected by both families and the community they had expected to manipulate. Vernon straightened his shoulders and turned to his father, who squeezed his arm with silent pride. "Your mother would have handled it the same way," the older man said quietly, with dignity. "What would you do if you discovered your partner and best friend had been betraying you for months?" Vernon's response might surprise you. The reception venue transformed from wedding celebration to something entirely different. White roses and silver decorations remained, but the atmosphere had shifted from romantic anticipation to community solidarity. Vernon moved through the space not as a humiliated groom, but as a host whose dignified response had earned respect rather than pity. Servers continued circulating with champagne and hors d'oeuvres as guests clustered in animated conversation. The wedding cake, a three-tiered creation Vernon had selected himself, stood untouched on its display table. "What should we do with the cake?" the catering manager asked discreetly. "Serve it," Vernon decided. "No reason good food should go to waste because of bad behavior." The practical response earned an appreciative nod from the manager, who promptly arranged for the cake to be moved to the cutting station. Vernon noticed several elderly guests looking relieved, his mother's friends who had traveled considerable distances for the celebration. Grace's mother approached Vernon hesitantly, her expression torn between maternal loyalty and social embarrassment. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't fully conceal the redness around her eyes. "She made a terrible mistake, but she's still my daughter," she said, watching Vernon for signs of the anger he hadn't yet displayed. "I don't blame you for supporting her," Vernon replied. "That's what families should do." "How can you be so calm?" she asked, genuinely perplexed. "Because anger would only extend their power over my life. I prefer peace." Vernon's father overheard and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Turning to the gathered guests, he declared, "My son handles truth the way he handles everything, with dignity." The validation from the older man carried particular weight with the audience, many of whom belonged to the same generation. Vernon noticed several people nodding in agreement, the social judgment solidifying in his favor. The DJ, uncertain about appropriate music under the circumstances, approached Vernon for guidance. "What's the protocol here?" he asked nervously. "I've never handled a reception without, well, a marriage." "Let's keep it dignified but positive," Vernon suggested. "Perhaps start with some light jazz, then transition to something more upbeat after dinner." Nothing romantic, obviously. After a brief conversation, gentle jazz replaced the planned romantic ballads. Vernon moved through the room, thanking guests for their support and ensuring everyone had refreshments. Rebecca joined him as he paused near the gift table, now awkwardly irrelevant. "The photographers are asking what to do with the formal portraits taken before the ceremony." "Tell them to deliver everything as contracted," Vernon said. "Documentation matters, especially in unexpected circumstances." "You're handling this remarkably well," she observed. Vernon's composed expression softened slightly. "I had time to process the shock privately. Today was simply about truth, not revenge." He surveyed the room, noting how guests had reorganized themselves. Grace's bridesmaids huddled uncomfortably near the exit, while Vernon's colleagues from the digital forensics firm gathered supportively around his father, Mrs. Abernathy sat at a table with several elderly relatives, recounting what she had observed over recent months. I saw them embrace when they thought no one was looking, she explained. At first, I thought perhaps I was misinterpreting. At my age, you sometimes wonder if your eyes are playing tricks. But there was no mistaking the way they looked at each other. The wedding photographer showed selected images on her camera to interested guests, further validating Vernon's claims. Professional habit, she explained. I document everything at events, not just the scheduled moments. After ensuring guests were settled, Vernon stepped to the center of the room and tapped a spoon against his water glass. Conversation quieted as attention turned to him. I want to thank everyone for your understanding today, he began. What was planned as a celebration of marriage has become something different, but no less valuable, a celebration of truth and community support. He raised his glass. To truth, sometimes painful, always necessary. As guests echoed his toast, Vernon noticed Grace's father returning to the reception alone, his expression grave. Their eyes met briefly across the room, an acknowledgement passing between them of standards upheld and expectations betrayed. Several of Vernon's colleagues approached to express their support, the conversation turning to the inevitable workplace complications ahead. Marcus will try to spin this, predicted Lisa from accounting. He's always been good at shifting blame. Documentation matters, Vernon repeated his professional mantra. Facts speak for themselves. As the impromptu reception continued, Vernon found a quiet corner where he could momentarily step away from his role as composed center of the unexpected drama. His father joined him, 2 glasses of scotch in hand. Your mother would have been proud today, the older man said, passing Vernon a drink. Of my public humiliation? Vernon asked, allowing vulnerability to show for the first time. Of your self-respect. Not every man can stand in truth when it would be easier to crumble. Vernon's voice finally broke slightly. I loved her, Dad. I know. But she wasn't worthy of that love. Some people can't recognize value until it's gone. Vernon sipped his scotch, allowing the burn to center him. After a moment, he straightened his shoulders. Tomorrow we deal with the professional fallout. Marcus won't go quietly. His father nodded, understanding that today's public revelation was merely the first phase of consequences. The personal betrayal had been addressed. The professional entanglements would require equally strategic handling. One battle at a time, his father advised. Today, you've won the most important one, the battle for your dignity. As they prepared to rejoin the gathering, Rebecca approached with news that several guests had organized an impromptu dinner at Vernon's favorite restaurant for later that evening. They want to make sure you're not alone tonight, she explained. Vernon accepted with genuine gratitude, recognizing that while one family bond had been severed, many others had been strengthened by the day's events. Perhaps we should call this a liberation celebration rather than a wedding reception, Mrs. Abernathy suggested as Vernon passed her table. Far better to discover snakes before they've completely taken over the garden. The botanical metaphor, so reminiscent of conversations with his mother, brought Vernon his first genuine smile of the day. You sound just like her, he told Mrs. Abernathy. She always said you were the wisest gardener she knew. Eleanor understood that proper pruning is essential for healthy growth, the elderly woman replied. You've done some necessary pruning today. Monday morning arrived with unseasonal sunshine, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the offices of Meridian Digital Securities. Vernon stepped from the elevator into the open concept workspace where he'd built his reputation over 15 years. Conversations hushed as he passed, colleagues offering supportive nods or awkward smiles. News of Saturday's events had clearly spread. Vernon proceeded directly to his office, maintaining the same composed demeanor he'd displayed at the wedding. The weekend had provided time for strategic planning with Rebecca, preparing for the inevitable professional complications. Marcus's desk in the financial analytics department remained empty, a small mercy Vernon hadn't anticipated. He had just settled at his desk when Diane Matthews, the HR director, appeared in his doorway. At 57, Diane had been with the company since its founding and was known for her straightforward approach to personnel issues. "Vernon, do you have a moment?" she asked, her professional tone undercut by concern. "Of course," he replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "I've received some concerning allegations from Marcus about your conduct," she began carefully. "Given that you both work here, albeit in different departments, I needed to address this immediately." Before Vernon could respond, Marcus appeared behind Diane, his normally confident posture now aggressive. "There he is," Marcus announced loudly enough for the entire floor to hear. "Our digital forensics expert who illegally accessed private communications." Vernon remained seated as several colleagues paused their work to observe the confrontation. "Vernon invaded private communications. Isn't that concerning for a digital forensics expert?" Marcus continued, addressing the growing audience rather than HR. "I documented evidence of fraud affecting my personal finances, which is both legal and ethical," Vernon replied evenly. "He fabricated evidence for revenge." Vernon turned to Diane, ignoring Marcus's outburst. "I've prepared documentation of all my actions, including legal consultation confirming their propriety." He retrieved a folder from his briefcase. "I've also documented Marcus's use of company resources during our friendship." The folder contained printouts showing Marcus had used company equipment to communicate with Grace and access financial information about Vernon. Vernon had discovered these connections while performing his systematic investigation. Diane reviewed the contents quickly, her expression shifting from concern to professional determination. "Marcus, we should continue this conversation privately." Before they could leave, Lisa Chen from accounting spoke up from her desk. "I was at the wedding." Vernon handled himself with complete professionalism, more than most would. Several other colleagues murmured agreement, creating a visible shift in the office dynamics. Marcus, realizing his attempt to damage Vernon's reputation had backfired, followed Diane with reluctance. By afternoon, Vernon received an email requesting his presence at a meeting with senior management. He arrived prepared with additional documentation, but found it unnecessary. The company's legal team had reviewed the situation and determined Vernon had acted within appropriate boundaries. Marcus, however, faced an internal investigation regarding misuse of company resources. "We're initiating a complete audit of Mr. Daniels's work activities," the chief security officer informed Vernon. "Preliminary findings suggest multiple policy violations beyond those you documented." Vernon nodded, understanding the implications. "I'd prefer to recuse myself from any involvement in that investigation. The personal connection creates potential conflicts." "Already noted," the security officer confirmed. "Your professional discretion is appreciated." As Vernon returned to his office, he found several emails from clients expressing support. News traveled quickly in professional circles, and the digital forensics community was particularly attuned to matters of evidence and integrity. 2 days later, Vernon sat at a corner table in a quiet coffee shop, checking his watch. Grace had requested this meeting via text, the first contact since the wedding. He'd agreed, but chosen a public location. She arrived looking noticeably different, designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a sweater, her usual perfect makeup subdued. The slight swell of early pregnancy was visible as she sat across from him. "Thank you for meeting me," she began, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "I made a terrible mistake. The baby might be yours. We should do a test." Vernon maintained his composed expression. The timing makes that mathematically impossible, as you well know. People are judging me everywhere I go, she continued, her voice breaking. You've ruined my reputation. Your actions determine the consequences. I merely declined to be your victim. Grace leaned forward, desperation evident. We could try counseling, for the baby's sake. The kindest thing I can do for that child is insist on honesty from the beginning. Other patrons glanced their way, several with flickers of recognition. The story had clearly spread beyond their immediate circle. This isn't just about us anymore, Grace persisted. This is about a child. A child deserves parents who value truth, Vernon replied. I wish you both well, but my responsibility ended the moment Marcus claimed paternity publicly. He's been fired, Grace said, a hint of accusation in her tone. The company found evidence of other improprieties once they started looking. We're struggling already. Vernon considered her statement carefully. The company's investigation was independent of my actions. Professional consequences often follow ethical lapses. You could help us, just until we get back on our feet. I've already provided significant financial support that was misused, Vernon observed. Further assistance would only enable continued patterns. He stood, leaving enough cash to cover both their drinks. I wish you well, Grace, but my life no longer has room for people who see honesty as optional. As he walked toward the door, Grace called after him, You'll regret this when you're alone again. Vernon paused, turning back to meet her gaze. I've learned the difference between solitude and loneliness. And one is a choice that preserves dignity. The other is accepting relationships that diminish it. I choose the former. Several cafe patrons, who had been pretending not to listen, nodded appreciatively at Vernon's response. An elderly man near the door caught Vernon's eye as he left. Well handled, son, he murmured. Some lessons come at a high price. The final resolution came a week later in Rebecca's office. Vernon signed legal documents formally separating all financial entanglements and establishing clear boundaries. The paternity test results lay on the table between them, confirming what the timeline had already suggested. Once signed, these documents sever all financial connections, Rebecca explained, indicating where Vernon should initial. The paternity test results confirm what you suspected. And they can make no future claims, Vernon asked, reviewing the language carefully. His professional attention to detail had served him well throughout this process. None. The documentation of fraud attempts protects you completely. Rebecca pointed to specific clauses she'd carefully crafted. Should they attempt further contact or claims, there are significant penalties. Vernon signed the final page with his characteristic precise handwriting. Then we're finished. Technically, Rebecca observed, watching her brother closely. Emotionally is another matter. Emotions follow actions, Vernon replied, capping his pen. I'm choosing actions that lead to peace. As he placed the pen on the completed documents, Vernon felt the weight of recent weeks beginning to lift. Now we can all move forward in truth. You know, Rebecca said as she gathered the papers, most people wouldn't have handled this with such restraint. Vernon considered this assessment. Restraint implies suppression. This wasn't about holding back. It was about responding proportionally. Mother always said excessive reaction gives away your power. Another Eleanor Miller special, Rebecca smiled, referencing their mother's collection of life philosophies. She was rarely wrong, Vernon noted as he prepared to leave. Rebecca stopped him at the door. The firm's partners want to meet with you tomorrow. Something about reorganizing the compliance division. Vernon nodded, unsurprised that professional consequences continued to unfold. I'll be prepared. 6 months transformed Vernon's home as thoroughly as events had transformed his life. The dining room that once held wedding plans now featured architectural drawings for a home renovation project. Wedding gifts had been returned, photographs removed, and spaces reimagined with fresh purpose. The garden that had been planned for entertaining now focused on contemplative spaces and vegetable beds, a return to the practical aesthetics his mother had favored. Vernon found unexpected peace in the physical labor of gardening, the methodical process of preparation and patience resonating with his nature. Evening light spilled through windows as Vernon hosted a small dinner party. Rebecca and her husband, his father, Mrs. Abernathy, and several friends who had stood by him through recent months. The conversation flowed easily around his redecorated dining table, evidence of a life recalibrated rather than diminished. "The zucchini soup is excellent," Rebecca's husband commented, accepting a second serving. "I didn't know you'd taken up serious cooking." "Another systematic pursuit," Vernon explained. "Cooking follows logical processes with predictable outcomes when done correctly. Plus, it's delicious," his father added practically. As dinner progressed to coffee and dessert, the conversation inevitably turned to recent developments. "Heard Marcus lost his job after the company audit," Rebecca's husband mentioned casually. "Apparently, there were financial improprieties going back years." "Their choices, their consequences," Vernon replied, his tone free of satisfaction or bitterness. "I prefer to focus on my own path." Rebecca studied her brother with professional assessment. "You're different now, stronger." "Clarity tends to have that effect," Vernon acknowledged. "When you know who you can trust, life becomes simpler." The promotion to head of the new Integrity Compliance Division had come with increased responsibility and recognition. Vernon's methodical approach to documentation and ethical standards had transformed from personal defense mechanism to professional methodology, earning him respect beyond his immediate department. Mrs. Abernathy, now using a cane but still sharp-eyed, asked the question others had avoided. "Have you heard from either of them?" "No," Vernon replied, "and that's perhaps the greatest gift of this experience. Some absences are improvements, Mrs. Abernathy observed, like removing weeds from a garden. The conversation shifted to Vernon's professional news, his department's growing influence in the company's governance structure. Apparently, handling personal crisis with professionalism impressed the partners, he explained, without false modesty. "You've created something valuable from a painful experience," his father noted. Not everyone manages that transformation. Later, as guests departed, Vernon's father remained behind to help with cleanup, moving slowly but insisting on contributing. They worked companionably in the kitchen, falling into patterns established during Vernon's childhood. "You're dating again?" his father asked, referencing an earlier comment about Vernon's dinner with a colleague. "Just dinner," Vernon clarified. "But yes, I'm open to possibilities." "Good," his father nodded approvingly. "Your mother always said the best revenge is living well." "I'm not interested in revenge," Vernon corrected gently, "just in living authentically." The following Saturday, Vernon helped his father with seasonal maintenance on the older man's home. They worked methodically through a checklist Vernon had prepared, completing tasks with shared satisfaction in work well done. "Your approach to life," his father observed as they repaired loose guttering, "reminds me more of your mother every day. That careful attention to what matters, letting go of what doesn't." Vernon accepted the comparison as the profound compliment it represented. Eleanor Miller's standards had shaped both her children, but Vernon had always embodied her methodical precision most clearly. Their grocery stop afterward brought an unexpected encounter. Vernon rounded the produce section to find Marcus and Grace in heated conversation beside the apple display. Grace's pregnancy was now prominently visible, her hand resting protectively on her expanded midsection. They fell silent upon noticing Vernon and his father. Marcus recovered first, defensiveness immediately apparent. "We're doing fine, in case you're wondering." "I wasn't, actually," Vernon replied honestly. "But I wish you well." Grace stepped forward slightly. "The baby's due next month." "Congratulations," Vernon said with genuine civility. "Every child deserves love and honesty." Marcus's expression hardened. "You think you're so superior." "No," Vernon replied, selecting his produce and preparing to move on. "Just happier with my choices than you appear to be with yours." He guided his shopping cart past them without further engagement, his father following with quiet approval. They completed their shopping in comfortable silence, the encounter significant only in how insignificant it felt to Vernon. The people who had occupied such central positions in his life had become peripheral figures, their power to affect him diminished by truth and time. That evening, as they shared dinner on Vernon's back porch, his father gestured toward the garden Vernon had planted where wedding gifts had once been stored. "Your mother always said crisis reveals character," the older man observed. Vernon nodded, watching light fade over his new landscaping. "She was right. I learned more about myself in one day than in years of comfort." "Are you glad you found out the truth?" his father asked, the question they'd never directly addressed. Vernon considered carefully before answering. "Truth is always better than comfortable illusion. Always." "And the future? Another relationship?" "When it's right," Vernon replied. "I'm in no hurry. Some things are worth waiting for, like respect." A comfortable silence settled between them as they finished their meal. Eventually, Vernon checked his watch. "Oh, time to get you home," he said, helping his father from the chair. As they walked toward the car, Vernon paused to look back at his transformed home. The garden, where wedding decorations had been stored, the office where he'd discovered betrayal, the dining room now filled with projects rather than wedding plans. "And isn't that the essence of wisdom," he reflected, "knowing where you truly belong?" His father squeezed his shoulder in silent understanding as they proceeded to the car, two men who valued actions over words, truth over comfort, and dignity above all. Share your story of standing in dignity despite betrayal. The world needs your wisdom. Vernon's story reminds us that dignity isn't measured by what happens to us, but by how we respond. When faced with betrayal, the easy path is emotional reaction, anger, public scenes, or private collapse. The harder road, the one that preserves our self-respect, is methodical truth-seeking followed by proportional response. This isn't about revenge, but about refusing to participate in our own diminishment by others who mistake our kindness for weakness. We've all experienced betrayal in some form, perhaps not as dramatic as Vernon's wedding day revelation, but painful nonetheless. Family members who take advantage, friends who betray confidences, partners who break trust, these wounds cut deepest when they come from those we've supported and loved. Vernon's approach offers a template. Document the truth, present it calmly, and establish boundaries without surrendering your own dignity to rage or despair. Age brings perspective that younger generations often mistake for weakness. The calm that comes from decades of experience isn't passivity, it's strategic patience. Vernon's story celebrates the power that comes not from emotional outbursts, but from the steady accumulation of evidence and allies. This is wisdom in action, knowing when to wait, when to speak, and when to stand firmly in your truth, regardless of who attempts to rewrite it. Perhaps you've experienced your own version of wedding day betrayal or family exploitation. Remember that Vernon's greatest strength wasn't in his evidence, but in his self-respect. Your story doesn't end with betrayal. It continues with how you choose to rebuild. The most powerful moment in any relationship is when you finally understand your own worth and require others to recognize it too. Share your story of standing in dignity despite betrayal. The world needs your wisdom,